but to also reflect with us on how the contemporary design process of building has fundamentally changed to, let's say, architectural visualization. So we could say that from Renaissance engravings to computer-generated images, visualizations have preceded completed buildings since time immemorial, forming the space of a space of architectural speculation and experimentation. And it is the premise of this that we've invited Forbes to speak and to share his work with us. With a very provocative title, Nostalgia. So I remember when we received that by email some months ago, well, it's sort of whet our appetite for what was to come. Forbes is joining us from well, his home base in Denmark, in Copenhagen, from his studio. And well, welcome, and we look forward to the talk. He has been working for nearly 20 years in various UK and international practices across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Well, as a digital artist or visualizer, he's been very much involved in helping architects and developer clients in creating the images that communicate the design concepts, functions, craft, beauty of buildings and master plans. So the, well, I would say this is, well, I'm very curious to hear more about the kind of thought process that goes into these collaborations as an act of, well, thinking and making and speculation. Which is far more than just simply visualizing somebody else's ideas, but what is the role of interpreting somebody else's ideas and expressing that. And that is where we want to get to here, is the role as a speculator in this, you know, sort of metaphorical sense, and not as somebody who simply produces imagery based on other things, so that there is a kind of interpretation of many ideas, an ethos, a position that is taken in this kind of work. So I mean, I have to say, I always am hesitant with this, with the term architectural visualizer, because it's also, well, or you understand what I mean, Forbes. I think clearly in this, we had a conversation a few weeks back. So, but I want to just make it clear to the audience too. I mean, I was thinking, since our last talk, you know, there was a kind of tradition stemming from the Beaux-Arts and even earlier, actually, you know, about the kind of architectural renderer. And there's a different, you know, and that was really, you know, who, there's some analogies to that today, which was, you know, different than the kind of drafts person and these things. So anyways, I hope that we'll have a great discussion at the end about all these different forms of architectural production and their cultural and ethical significance, actually. So at any rate, the floor is yours now. And thank you again so much for doing this. We wish it was, of course, in person, but it cannot be, but we're glad that you are safe and sound there, even if it's gray and cold. So
yeah,
Forbes, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to ramble to you all 45 minutes to 1 hour. Thinking about that base in Copenhagen, I was just talking with Solomon and Ludo that we were told today that so far Denmark's had 7 minutes on average of sunlight a day, which is not too good. But yeah, no, there's the word speculation before I sort of begin talking a bit about the past and where I've been and where I'm going. You know, if you Google the word speculation, it says the forming of a theory or conjecture without firm evidence. And I think to touch on perhaps a problem with the industry in terms of renderings, that there perhaps hasn't been a theory, or there perhaps there's just been a lack of thought, a set of rules or principles as to why things are done and it's easier to do things with speed and very cheaply now because of technology. But we'll get on to that later. If I can just share this here.
Forbes, I would just, something with the sound, you're coming in very soft. So, we can hear you clearly, but it's a little bit soft. So,
Okay.
if there's any way to change that, I think it would be good.
Yeah. Is that better now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So just a little bit of background about myself and the studio prior to 19. So I actually, I'm calling this chapter 1, let's see. I actually didn't study architecture. I studied product design from Aberdeen, city in Scotland. So in 2003, I graduated from College University. My father was an engineer, and I was working part-time at university doing structural drawings using AutoCAD. And when I graduated from university, I guess I wasn't ready to leave home. I wasn't, I just don't think I was mature enough actually to take that next step. And I set up a small company, aptly called Extrude, because in Aberdeen, it's an oil import, was the oil and gas capital of Europe, and there was a need for visualization in the oil and gas industry, and also a need for visualization in the architectural industry as well. I guess the issue back then was that the clients that we had, a bit of a shame to admit this, but I guess the architecture in Scotland, perhaps, or in Aberdeen, is maybe lacking in imagination and creativity. And of course, the subject that was presented to me, I guess, wasn't really driving me, or wasn't really bringing the best out of presenting an opportunity to craft something beautiful in an image. And that sort of came about in a conversation with a friend who's an architect in London, had worked with many different architects, and this sort of honest conversation over being about, oh, I don't like your images because of the subject, not necessarily because of your ability. And of course, like anything, when you're studying or when you're practicing a profession, you will learn from your clients, you will learn from peers around you. And being up there in the northeast of Scotland, you were very much secluded from what I still would call the real world. And everyone says that you leave university and you enter the real world, and then you start to learn. And sort of aptly timed with that was a recession in 2007. So there wasn't a lot of work, and for 2 years I was kind of plodding around, deciding on what my next move would be. And then in 2009, I decided to move to London, and recession, because large visualization companies had downsized, there was a lot of desks available to rent, and I rented a desk. In 2010, one of the clients that I met, Doug and Morris, amongst others, they were also they weren't actually downsizing. We were actually 12 people at the time when they were growing, so we were moving into a larger office. And we took some desks with them, and by working within their office, we were then exposed to other architects from London. So strangely, to think that it was going to be very, very hard to crack London, and I don't mean this in a sort of an arrogant way at all. It's a very sort of incestuous industry, and you have some work printed in the Architect's Journal or online or on the zine, and a lot of architects were coming asking for visualizations. The issue was that we were working with people that we were having conversation with, so we were just maybe 3 or 4 people at the time, especially working within Doug and Morris's office. There was conversation every day, and of course, because of the recession, we were working on competitions where the sort of the craft of the image making was really at the forefront of what we were doing. And it didn't feel like there was an awful lot of commercialism to the product. And the issue arose that, Doug and Morris are growing. They are now, amongst other sort of clients, they're maybe 50 people or 60 people. So how do I then scale up my offering where they will need more work and other architects need more work? And we tried to do it, and I think we did it fairly successfully. We grew in the next sort of 7 to 8 years to 15 artists, and it sort of fluctuated. But the issue for me was that I stopped making. So I was teaching, and I was teaching my team, and my team was teaching me back. But really, or I myself stopped physically making. And then you kind of doubt yourself that, okay, I'm running a business and I'm mentoring these people and I'm going to meetings and I'm dealing with HR issues. But, essentially I stopped making. And that niggle was always there. And then running parallel alongside that, I met my wife who's from Denmark, and we have two lovely daughters. So at the time I decided that actually the only way to truly change direction or to stop and pause and think is to close the London studio. Um, and that's what I did. So in 2009, I closed the London studio. The interesting thing about chapter one and that time in London was how we decided to present our work. So I think I caught the wave at a nice time. I guess a lot of this is success, or however you want to describe success, but we became very popular, and we were known for having a strong opinion on our approach, which I'll go into in a second. But we also decided that we don't want to try and, although we're in the rat race of London, we kind of want to not join everyone else. So a lot of people were presenting the work online. It became glossy. It had this other thing because the images never left the digital world. They were always viewed on a screen. So we decided to make books of our work. And I know that Solomon shared this foreword by David Bickle of Harmony of Colour, but so we decided to we made 4 books: of Perception of Reality, Seduction of Light, Harmony of Colour, and Quartet, which was the last book. But the interesting thing in the curation of this book, we were doing around 30 images a month, around 400 images a year, and we had to pick 30 images to make this each book, 30, and it means that 370 images never made the cut. Now, there's bread and butter work, and there's, of course, like I said before, you employ people and you need to take on other work that maybe 100% doesn't quite fit our process. And when I say this, of course, I know this is quite live on YouTube, but this is nothing against the architects that came to us to make images for them. I think the problem was that we weren't trusted. And the problem was that, of course, naturally, you want to have ownership of the building that you've designed. And you want to be involved in that process. But I think for the images that never made the cut, it was nothing to do with the architecture itself. It was to do with the fact that we never really were allowed to stamp our principles onto this project. And it was very important for me that, if people were talking about the studio, if we were continually striving to work with architects, that beautiful projects. So this subject was always this thing that we were trying to reach out for. But if we do not curate this book in a way that is quite anal, actually, how we lay out, I know I put the books on Instagram for you to download, and if you look at that, it's a sequence, images that sit next to other images, there's a sort of transition of colour or season. All of that is thought out. The colour of the cover, the end grain of the papers, the colour of the end grain against the colour of the cover. So everything was sort of quite carefully scrutinised, because we knew that when these books go around the world, or when they sit on architects' desks, we didn't want them to be put in the bin. We wanted them to be a catalogue of work that from the library of the university, for example. People could reference this work. So that was a main factor for me, that without stopping fully, I could never change direction or take a breath and do something. So a lot of this is a little bit wordy, but just to explain our sort of theory behind this, that imagery is not only about recording and the illustration of a place, building, an object, but the communication of a certain feeling and atmosphere, and how the quality of an image frames this perception of reality, which is managing to move the viewer. When you look at an image, and this is where sort of nostalgia will come into play, which I'll go on to later, but it needs to really resonate with you. There was a film that was made at the studio by a good friend, Paul Reardon, and there's this line that I said completely off the cuff about thinking about it, that we don't make images for architects, we make images that your grandmother will fall in love with. And Zine picked up on this, and I think a lot of people found it quite funny, but it's kind of, the point was that anyone can have an interest in art or imagery. And really, if an image is successful, it will allow someone to make someone stop and maybe look at that again. So if we talk about a successful image, we really want something that it's not just for a planning document. It's not just to tick a box. It's not to get something over the line. It's actually a piece of work that we can be proud of, that you can be proud of, that we can frame and put it online. And we would be very happy to wake up every morning and look at that subject that's hanging on the wall. So in order to get there, if we don't have a set of rules or a set of principles, then everything is fluid. And therefore, if the subject is not created by us, the architect approaches us or the designer approaches us, and we're taking someone else's design. If we don't have a set of rules about how to set composition, how to set light and tonality, then we just look like everyone else, perhaps, because it's not really considered. And the interesting thing in these four pillars is that they need to be examined within this order, because the predecessor needs to be constant. So you cannot test and examine light if the composition is not fixed. So in the process with the architect, or if you're thinking of your own projects. And I think, if everyone's architects in this Zoom meeting, which I know you are, you're already winning because you're designing the subject. So this is your baby, or this is your beautiful object that you are visualizing. So you're really in control of this process. But if the composition's not locked, then how do you know how the light's going to fall? And I think as we go through this, that's what gives this strength in these principles, that there's a strong composition based on a set of rules. I'll talk about in a second. Then the light is examined, and of course the materiality, all of this is going to add to depth in the image, because of course how you view something will create depth. If there's setbacks or pushes or pulls within the facade. Also light, of course, will create depth, but materiality and colour and tone will push or pull the architecture closer or farther away from us. And then, of course, there's the atmosphere, which we've been told that this dreamy atmosphere, or this magic, that a lot of architects say that. And it's quite funny that they say, well, bring the magic. And it's just funny that recently I have this subscription to Masterclass online, where you can watch many different disciplines talk. You have Alicia Keys to music production, Gordon Ramsay does cooking, and Penn and Teller, magicians. I watched this recently, and they were talking about misdirection. And they were saying that, in magic, misdirection is there to allow the story to be played out in the eyes of the viewer. And I think that's a really important point to consider within visualization, within image making, photography, painting, anything. But there needs to be, in order for your story to be told and be, there needs to be misdirection. You're not lying to the viewer, but there needs to be key elements within that narrative that you will consider so that your eye looks at these things within a certain order. Of course, if you spend a very long time, you can scrutinize everything in that image, but it's 2020 and images are on Instagram, and people are flicking through and people are scrolling. So how do you get someone to stop, whether it's in a museum of 100 images or, you know, of 1,000? But that really kind of hit home to me when I'm always thinking about how do we describe what we do. It is a bit like misdirection, um, so that we're thinking, okay, we want this he or she to look here first and then down. And if I can just come out of this quickly, I can give you a good example of this. It's a photographer called Nadav Pandey. This is one of his photos with two books that I recommend. One is on the Yangtze River, and one is called Dust, which is an ex-nuclear testing site. And this is super interesting for me, but if we draw a triangle image, there are three kind of subjects, if you like, and subjects don't need to be human, they don't need to be people, animals, whatever, but actually, in this case, a little bit like music where you don't play a beat, um, or the cliche of the spaces in between, but this is, I believe this is actually the photographer himself, so he's put himself within the image and he's looking up at nothing, he's looking up to a hole, but that hole within this facade is probably the most important part within the composition. Then, of course, with perspective, you're drawing your eye down to the end four windows that are sitting on their own, and then you come back to the frame. Similarly here, with the image we did for Common Dork a while ago, there's a triangle that can be drawn between these two subjects. And the nice thing about this sort of theory is that if you have two subjects equally on either side, if we didn't have the man at the back there, the conductor, then your eye is bouncing back and forth between these two people, and there's something less calm about that. Whereas with this triangle, we can decide to start here, and we can float back and float along to her, or we can go the other way. Equally here. So yeah, just to recap what I said there. So regardless of the subject matter, still life, self-portrait, landscape, and building, all of these elements are fundamentally important to create a sense of depth when you look. And for the composition, I never really said this, but I think also if I'm going to a building, it's very rare as a visualizer that actually in the years I've done this, you don't often visualize a building and then see it in real life. So I think a lot of the principles that I'm taking, of course, is what do you see when you go to a building? And I think you want to almost square up to this. Facades are very, very important, of course, because there's a rhythm within that form, and a lot of here normally it's the opening and the pushes and pulls within that. If you're viewing something in a very strong perspective, it becomes very weak because the building is falling away from you. It's continuously falling away. The vanishing point is super, super strong. And we ended up sort of naturally making these elevation perspectives, as we call them, which I know became very popular in the industry, where we're working to a grid. We don't necessarily follow golden triangles or really, but the grid is there, which I can show you later within V-Ray or whatever rendering engine. There's always a grid within a camera. It feels that it makes sense to think about proportions in that way. Why not make the verticals vertical and make the horizontals horizontal? Maybe it's OCD, I don't know. But if something is slightly off, it seems a bit of a shame that it could have been a stronger representation. So in chapter 2, course, I no longer have a studio in London, and I've now been in Denmark for 2 years, and I took some time off to be a father again. And I also make music for fun, and I wanted to focus on that. But then naturally, I am still drawn to image making, and I met a good friend called Bickle, who I'm working with now, Copenhagen studio, and we decided to open a studio here, but try to do things differently. So we're actually not aiming to have more staff or artists than we are, and we're not aiming to have a lot of clients necessarily, which I know that seems silly if you're running a business, but what we're trying to do is work with less people, but really put more time and craft into the work that we're making. And when I say into the work that we're making, I'm talking about self-directed work. And we had many conversations about the industry, and there are thousands of companies that will make renderings. And if you look on Instagram, it's very hard now to differentiate between the studios because we're all using software. There's Autodesk, Chaos Group, V-Ray, Corona, it's rendering engines. And so we started to really think about why do we look at images? Why would you hold on an image? How can an image hold a room? If you have a white gallery and you have an image on the wall, what does it need to have to hold it? And this word nostalgia keeps coming up. That really the nostalgia heading sits on top of the principles that we were sort of preaching before, because you could describe nostalgia as imperfection, or to do with memory, so you can't quite remember something fully, so you have to piece together how you felt and what you saw at the time. And I find this a little bit of text to say nostalgia is a memory or a feeling when one reflects and recalls a dialogue. So it's a story with yourself and with the past. And it's impossible to recall it 100%. So we could say that this is pieced together from different emotions and senses. And then, of course, we're talking about sensory feelings, where is it something you've seen visually, heard audibly, olfactory, and a lot of museums can play on senses. You can weirdly you can walk past someone on the street and you can smell a perfume or an aftershave, and you think of someone in your past or a time in your past. And of course, tangibly is a hard one for us because what we make is visual, but then of course we're printing it, so we're taking this into the real world where you can bring it to the people who experience it. And then I decided, okay, well, let's just ask Wikipedia what they say. And or someone's posted it, that it's a sentimental longing and wistful affection for a period in the past, typically a period of place. And in our discussions about this, of course, architects send us references all the time. We're designing a building and we like this and we like this. And it's always something that's older. 9 times out of 10, it's something that stood the test of time. It's covered in imperfection. It's weathered. It has character. And these are things that always come into conversation with clients. And an architect, when they build a building, of course it can be pristine, and there's this tectonic thing about how the facade's put together, and the concrete is acid etched or whatever it is, but there's still something beautiful about craft, something beautiful about how those materials have been made by humans. And within that process, there's something imperfect with them. And then we're kind of bringing that conversation back to the industry of CGI, computer-generated imagery, which is a term that I don't enjoy, because think that's maybe part of the problem, is that the craft of this is being undervalued, or ignored, or not respected. That we're trying to put a humanistic approach into this and crafting the images where we're adding this imperfection deliberately, so that if there's a crack in the pavement, or if there's leaves in the ground, or if there's a plastic bag hanging from the lamppost, or you can really relate. It's similar to renderings where every image perhaps is 12 o'clock sun and it's bright blue skies. That's not real life. In Denmark, as I said at the beginning, we've had 7 minutes of sunlight in December. So I think it's a sort of a boldness, maybe, that if we're making images, we want to try and represent the moments that we enjoy and we feel through our work. And of course, we need to find the architects that sit on the same page that really want that. And then I started looking for articles, and I found this article by Colson Whitehead. It was about New York and how New York is dangerously becoming commercialized in terms of its architecture. And he wrote that our streets are calendars containing who we were and who we will be next. We see ourselves in this city every day when we walk down the sidewalk and catch our reflections in store windows, seek ourselves in this city each time we reminisce about what was there 5, 10, 40 years ago. Because all our old places are proof that we were here. And one day the city we built will be gone. When it goes, we go. And the buildings fall, we talk too. And that seems like a really sort of perhaps melodramatic statement, but I think there's a lot to be said in this, that we enjoy, and generalizing here maybe, but we enjoy the old. And there's something that I particularly love in Aarhus. There's the old time where they've reconstructed or moved old buildings and it's cobbled streets, and it's almost transporting you back in time. And you feel this sense of nostalgia, even in eras that, of course, we weren't around. And there's always that sort of conversation that you have, perhaps with your parents, where a building's been knocked down in the city, and your father or your mother says, "Oh yeah, that used to be this record store, it used to be this, and now it's this, garish, synthetic piece of architecture that's a real shame that that craft has been taken away." So this next slide, I guess I've kind of already spoken about this, but just to sort of reiterate the point, and I'm going to the last sort of paragraph here, that a painter, we look at painters, we look at those photographers, but we look at painters a lot, and even more so now. They're using eye and hand and brush stroke to create a moment in time. They're sitting down and maybe they're painting it there and then, or maybe they're using their memory and going away, or they start it and they go away and then they finish it with a recollection of what they saw and how they felt at the time. But they all hold imperfection. Of course, there are different types of paintings, and there are paintings that are incredibly real, but the degree of imperfection lessens our greatness, of course. But there is no emotion. These machines, they don't have a bad day. So they will render out the same thing, the same thing, the same thing over and over again. I guess also, and this is a bit risque, that this is live stream, but I do feel that often there are no loyalty from architects, because they have done what perhaps we did in the beginning. They started small and we've grown and we've become commercial, and then we have perhaps commercial clients and we have people to feed, and this sort of ball keeps rolling and rolling. So naturally they need renderings at the cheapest price. or because they're so busy, they need to have 10 rendering firms, that's 10, in their black book. But of course, if they're asking them all to do a similar thing, then you have all of these studios doing a similar thing. I don't want to go into this too much, but perhaps we need to teach architects, or we need to teach students that will become architects how to think in their own way to make imagery. And perhaps the only solution is that architects themselves create their images in-house and have their own style, truly. And yeah, I don't want to go too much into that, but let's move on to the next slide. So just on the line of the painters, paintings are respected, and they've been crafted purely by human hand. And these paintings are in museums, and they're viewed for years to come, and they're studied and enjoyed for years to come. So how do guys to be respected alongside the Turners or the Constables of our time? We recently had some work in Harris Museum in August, which is the first time actually we've ever had something in the museum. And it's for a new James Turrell extension, the artist James Turrell, who works wonders with light and colours. And it was a really proud moment for us, because I guess we've been talking about this for a long time, and we've been, not that the work isn't respected, but it's nice that this opportunity has come about, that actually they're printed and they're put on a wall, and people that are interested in art and can go there and view it. And perhaps it's a bit of a shift for the studio, and maybe a shift for the industry if there was more computer generated stuff actually put into exhibitions. The counter argument to what I'm saying, I'll be honest with you, is that there's photos in museums. So if we're talking about how maybe CGIs aren't respected, paintings are definitely respected. They're hung on the wall and the world, there's the photos. So the paintings are done by hand, and the photos are done with a camera. So where does our work sit in between this? And I actually, I'm not sure how to answer that, but one of the questions that came up in our own self-directed work was, if the painters of yesteryear had more digital tools, what would they create in today's world? So naturally, being in Denmark, we looked at Hammershøi, we looked at Peter Ilsted and Carl Husu, and a lot of their work focused around the home. And it kind of occurred to us that there's probably moments, we used to talk about the word moment a lot in chapter 1, where we would say we make a moment for an architect. I think the moment needs to be much more macro. So in your apartment, or in your house, or a building you go to in your everyday life, there will be a situation where light will fall on the wall. Maybe it's when you first wake up, or when you go to sleep at night, or you have a lamp on a table next to your bed or on your desk. And there's a small moment where really all the principles of image making, we believe, could be examined and talked about just within that setting that you see every day. And that's what we think is associated with nostalgia, because these paintings here, they're all of quite small scale. Like I said, it's residential, but the way that they've been composed, with rooms into rooms, windows placed strategically for light. So there's a huge amount of depth within these examples. They're not all from the same painter. And also the thing that really drives us within these paintings is the use of color. Now, course, we had a book called Harmony of Color, but at the time, we didn't really get it. You know, I'll be honest, it was something we were exploring, but not really sort of in depth enough. And I think color now, more than ever, is really important in our work. And I think if you go on our Instagram, I'll go through some of it later, but we can feel that there's a shift in what we're creating. And I know we're framing these images with color. That's also for another reason that we really enjoy the opposing colors within a palette. And this kind of goes back to, if I'm jumping back to when we're adding people and making that triangle. A lot of these paintings, the figures are blending very beautifully with the darker tones within the scene. So the woman here is very subtly within that scene. Sometimes there's no people at all, but also the colors that they're using. If you look at the greens of the landscape and the inversion or the opposite color of the woman's dress is red, or in this case, the navy blue, and there's a stronger orange. And there's a book actually which I can show you at the end, which is the Japanese color dictionary, which is super nice little pocket book where you can look at little swatches of colors that you can drive and bring into it. But there was one image in particular, and I can show you this, by Edward Bertinsky. He's a Canadian photographer, and he has several works published, one on quarries, and he takes a lot of aerial photographs. And this sort of premises is how mankind is sort of destroying the earth, actually. And he takes a lot of photos from the air and he looks at those volcanoes in different areas around the world where he finds natural beauty within these moments. And this is from a series of shipbreaking. And I find it really interesting that there's people added, because a lot of, maybe someone will ask a question at the end, but a lot of people asked about this, like how you add people to an industry. And it's just so beautiful that these guys have been working on the ship, but the sort of the tales of the time and how the ship's been broken down, and they naturally got dirty and rubbed. So the palette of their clothes, they're almost at one with the ship that's been broken down. And I think that's really interesting to bear in mind that, of course, if you're adding people to the images, where, not just where do they go, but what color are their clothes? Just recently, there's an Instagram account followed us called Lady with Red Bag, and I don't know if you've seen this, but there's obviously cutouts of people you can read. And this lady with a red bag is used far too often. And it really frustrates me that people can be so lazy to just not even cut someone out that they found themselves, but not even change the color of the bag. So you have this red bag going everywhere, regardless of the color of the brick or the color of the trees or the season. So I think this is really important, that you want the people to be within your image, and perhaps there's a subject that definitely you want them to stand out, but that color needs to be considered along with the other colors within the scene. Or in this case, they're there, but they're not really there. So they're gently sort of moving within that narrative. Yeah, so I've kind of gone over this, but the architecture of these paintings, there are beautiful moments of doorways, of openings and spaces, and they fluidly allow light to pass through. I think the light within them is the thing that's really interesting for us, because there's also a lot of dark. And of course, how do you create depth if the room is completely flooded with light? We get that, or we did get that quite a lot with requests that, oh, the floor is too dark. But if you look at a lot of Dutch and Flemish paintings, there's a deliberate use of darker tones in the foreground. And actually, if you were to study them, the light is actually not, it's not always correct. Often they have an animal, an ox or a cow or a white horse or a female figure in white that's deliberately that main subject character. But the darks is super, super interesting in imagery because these objects that are there still create a narrative, but they're very much set back in a subliminal way. Um, yeah, this is just talking about how familiar we are with our home. I think that even though you are in a commercial building or a larger scale building, naturally we will seek out the moments within that space where if you're picking a table, meeting a friend for a coffee, you know, there will be a subliminal thing where you want to sit within the corner or you want to be somewhere, not just have a private conversation, but perhaps it's um, it's these moments that you're relating to residentially where you live. So just I have a Photoshop file which I'm going to show you for one of these, but this was um, the first new piece of work that myself and Bickle did. And this is probably the most um, directly influenced by Hammershell because um, he actually created his house. So his house is here in Copenhagen. We found the plans and we made it immemorial. But this doorway, you know, all of these doorways were super, super interesting for us because naturally it puts this frame um, between the viewer and the end result or where you want to look at. And we always refer to this as in theatre, you would have the stage sets where you could move them left or right, or you would drop the light tower down onto the stage. And in the process of us making these, they all have openings. So this is an opening which is very close to us. And in the consideration of the process, you know, we always test light. Even though it's a small space, we will animate the sun. So, of course, if it's natural light, we'll animate the sun through many hours of the day, make a contact sheet, and then study these. Because, of course, if this frame here, in this instance, was very bright and the space beyond was very bright, then you don't really appreciate the darkness of the room which is in front. It just so happened that when we were doing the initial tests on this scene, we had sunlight coming in from the window that you cannot see and sort of dancing over this table and onto this chair. And again, referring to the era that the original painting was made, we felt that there was something much more mysterious, that there was a candlelight that out of shot. So often you don't want to see the source of the light, but you want to see the emission of light. So we have a very warm candlelight out of shot just behind here, which is then, of course, highlighting the main subject, which is not a figure, which is the very cliche wishbone chair. Um, so then this was the first time that we thought, well, just like an image has space to breathe, if you put it onto a page in an InDesign document, or if you're in a museum, there's spaces, white walls and spaces for images to breathe. How do we then add something extra to this image by creating a colored frame, which, you know, everyone can have mounts over a painting or a photograph, but we really feel that this colored frame in all of our new work is super, super important. Because it's almost always the opposite color of the main tone of the image. So in this case, we have this almost teal green paint which we put on the front door, which is different to the white, which is beyond within the dining room. And then this sort of salmon pink color. And similarly here, a similar process where we have a door open, but in this case, we decided to have more sunlight. So in the sort of testing of this scene, and of course, again, like I said to you before, if you're creating a 3D model, then it's your design, you're in charge. So we didn't need to cheat in this case. We just simply rotated the north point so that in the evening time, we had this very strong sense of warm sunlight in the window reveal here. And we also had to try and test this sort of room into a room. We actually, through this, I don't know if you can see my picture, through this door, we animate these doors with light beyond, so we test that we want light within that space, or if the door is slightly ajar, there's a sort of light spill. But at the end, and it's a little bit like this painting here, we thought there was something really quite beautiful if there's this kind of spookiness, this mysterious feeling that that door is open, but it leaves the viewer their imagination that, you know, maybe there is someone, you know, the classic set of eyes, you know, there is someone behind that door. And we wanted that door to be a character. So in its own right, that opening is a character in the scene, but it's definitely not fighting with what's happening here. Not really. And then if we talk about color, this very desaturated baby blue, for a better phrase, is the opposite of how we of course post-produce this. So we balance the color balance, the warmth, and this one so. And then naturally, so we have this, which is quite dry, we would say, actually, in terms of its palette as well, and leading into this where we have a bit more color. And then we've gone into this scene where it's a bigger room, it's a bigger space. But then in the process of thinking about this image, again, it was driven by two colors, which is something, you know, burgundy, which I've always been a very strong fan of. In fact, royal colors, and I guess if you watch Downton Abbey or any of these period dramas, there's always this beautiful, again, I think this relates back to sort of a longingness to be in the past and live in the past. I think it'd be fascinating to live back in that era and what they wear, and, you know, fabrics and materials and the colors. So it was kind of this driver of these two colors, which was this burgundy and then also this teal blue on this footstool. And again, looking through a space, and we're both musicians as well, so we quite enjoyed the fact that there was an evidence of you know, it's another subject. We're making a triangle that this violin's been played and it's now at rest. I think we called this waiting for morning light or something like that. And similarly here, there's a piano. Now, I've actually got the Photoshop file just to quickly go through this. I'm doing it fine. So this here, this is the raw render. And I guess what's important to say is that in the process, often it's just, oh yeah, we'll Photoshop it to death, and in some cases you can. But I think that the consideration within the raw render, we're not looking for photorealism at all. The renders that we take, maximum we take 1 hour to render. But it's the control of the passes or the elements that we can play with. So in this scene, pretty much all the detail and the imperfection was there. Maybe thinking of olden days, there's a store actually in Copenhagen, a lovely design company called Frama, and they have an old chemist, and they refurbished the apartment above, and there was an opening night there, and all they simply did was take the wallpaper off the walls to expose this old plaster, laughing plaster that was there, and each room sort of naturally had a different color to it. And they left it, you know, beautiful about that, that it was the original wall, imperfections throughout. So we've already added this sort of nostalgic feeling to the raw render. But if I just go through this, you can maybe see the very subtle things that we do. So we wanted to have a shadow and a highlight on this plane because it was leading your eye up along the deeper reveal of the window. So we actually changed the depth and we added it in. And also the texture on the chair we felt was too strong. So we rendered that and took some color away from this. And then I'll just walk you through, because this is quite interesting. I often talk about the hierarchy of a space. So for example, in this room, right now, tonally, the floor is very similar to the walls, which is very similar to the ceiling. And I think there's something to be gained when we start to change, and I'm talking about quite subtle shifts here, but the ceiling holds less color than the walls, and we've darkened the walls down slightly. But then the sort of key shift is that the floor is much darker. Excuse me. So the presence now is that the floor as a plane is a stronger element to the wall, and then the wall is a slightly stronger element to the ceiling. And if you turn them off, you can hopefully see what I mean. Often, if you half shut your eyes, it's a very good way of judging if something's too strong or too weak. And then also, we wanted this character here, this footstool, and we knew that we wanted the opposing color. So we actually went into Google and we searched teal blue velvet. We wanted the sort of feel of velvet. And this was then pasted within. Of course, I should add that we have things like this, which become quite beautiful in their own right. I always enjoy the fact that there's a script where you can randomly select these colors to all the objects in the scene. And probably this image would be more successful in the museum than the final rendering. But anyway, it's just to show you that you have different controls. So this is the diffuse layer where there's no light at all. You have 100% of the texture. So if you wish, and we did do this, to bring some texture back within the floor, because we opted for a parking floor, a diagonal, larger scale diagonal pattern here. And of course, this reflection, where this really shows 100% the sort of trails of feet and people that have been within this space, or perhaps it's going to be more reflective or more worn at the doorway as opposed to over at the corner of the room. So you can see there that that's, even though we darkened the floor in terms of hierarchy, then we felt it was too dark. So the diffuse layer, which is bringing the texture back, now you're definitely seeing the diagonals, which also help in terms of the perspective with your eye looking through to the piano. And then we've, I mean, this is super subtle, but we've darkened this corner because if you notice between the legs of this chair, the floor is a lighter tone, whereas actually if you darken that area, the chair now kind of disappears within that surface, which is quite nice because we don't really want to, we want it to be there, but not really there. Then if I just quickly jump to the top. So I mentioned other painters that were Danish, but along this process and our interest in color, we were looking at Hopper, Edward Hopper. And of course, there are similarities in subject matter because Hopper's work is often internal rooms or smaller spaces. And there's a much more bold, I guess, confident use of color. But just as we were building this up, we decided to, and this is just a Photoshop, this is just an adjustment layer, but we wanted to bring more color, definitively bring more color through the last opening and onto the piano. So the red actually is much more saturated. You can see that there. But also, we opted to flip the image. You know, we've never done this before actually, but sometimes we flip an image upside down. There's a good friend, Andy Gork, very good architect and artist, and he always said to me that you should flip the image upside down and half shut your eyes. Also, you can make the image black and white. To see if anything is standing out that shouldn't be standing out, or you could control it. But, and I know normally we read from left to right, but in this case, we decided to flip the image. And then in the presentation of the image, because we can, we've overlaid some concrete. This is, if I put this on normal, you know, this is just a concrete texture, which is on an overlay, and 25%. So it's, I guess we're trying to mimic or recreate the sense of a canvas, a digital canvas. And in my ramblings, I've probably said this already, but I can leave it up here. Well, I haven't mentioned Instagram, but it's really interesting that Instagram, you know, when we of course, you've maybe seen that image because we post it on Instagram. It presents to you, do you want, in fact, I think there's a filter called nostalgia on Instagram, so maybe we just use that. But the coloring, I don't know whether, this is more a question to myself as well in the studio, but when people have captured moments of the past within photography, technology has changed all the time. So of course you can talk about analog film and digital film and grain and how that holds color in different ways. So is it because of the cameras that were used to take the photographs of the past that, you know, similarly technology is getting more powerful, renderings are becoming easier to do, renderings are becoming cleaner, hyper-real is used a lot. But we can't really relate to that because life is not like that. You pour a concrete floor, it can crack. So is it that we want to have old cameras? I know that some ex-staff had a mid-format camera and a guy called Anton took wonderful photos and film of this mid-format camera. Actually, I have one on my wall at home. And you just can't recreate that same way with a digital camera. So I guess it's a question to leave with, that maybe the way that we're capturing the olden days, you know, there's something beautiful about black and white as well, that when there's no color, black and white photos almost strip away a sense of time. But with color and nostalgia within photography, we can almost hazard a guess as to when that photograph was taken. Of course, we know from the subject that, you know, bricks are bricks, you know, concrete is concrete. Fashion and how this is involved as well within the nostalgia within the imagery, what the colours of the clothes that they're wearing. And I think it's really important when I mentioned that we're thinking about when we're adding people into the narrative. What are they wearing and how are they sitting within that story that you're trying to depict? And the last thing is we often have quotes that we refer to and things that we say. And Pier Paolo actually said this to me, that if everything is important, nothing is important. So I guess what I mean by that is that sometimes clients want to see everything. And if you're going to see everything, then you see nothing. So there needs to be, hopefully, as I've rambled on about, but there needs to be a set of rules, a set of principles where we're guiding the eye calmly through a scene depicted. And that means that some things need to take a back seat. You know, some things are less prominent than others, but that's what would make the image successful. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Forbes. And there are definitely questions. Thank you for the very considered talk that has left us with a lot of food for thought. I believe, Jin, you had a question to kick off?
Okay, sure. So I feel like you would have thought about this, so I wanted to ask, to you, what is the relationship between craft and